Aswin Punathambekar, who is a colleague of ours. Most of us in this room know him. Completed his PhD at University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2007, taught briefly at SUNY Buffalo before joining us in the fall of 2007, where he's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies. Aswin's work questions what impact globalization has had on the culture industries in India, which include film, television, and the dot-com world, and particularly the dynamics of participatory culture in South Asia, particularly among fan communities. He's published articles on these interests in Biblio, the International Journal of Culture Studies, in the journal Gazette, which is the International Journal for Communication Studies, among other places. And he's also just published a co-edited book entitled Global Bollywood, which came out from NYU Press in 2008. He's currently working on a book entitled Looking LA, Talking Bombay, The Making and Marketing of Bollywood, which will be a historical and critical account of changes in Bombay's media industries, particularly as they collectively imagine Bollywood as some sort of a global object. His work is both ethnographic and archival. It's of relevance to scholars and to media specialists, people in the field, if you will, and you'll get a sense of that if you go to his extraordinary blog, which is on the handout for today's lecture, but it's called Bali Space 2.0. And it is in the world of blogs, Aswin's blog is extraordinarily lucid and useful and very, very popular, and I really encourage you to go look at it. He does all kinds of things on there that are very scholarly and civil and fun at the same time. So at any rate, let's welcome Aswin, who's going to talk on television, participatory culture, and politics, the case of Indian Idol.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I have to say, don't go to the blog just yet. Give me a couple of weeks. I haven't gone there in the last 4 months, so.
I was there today, and it was excellent.
All right. So this is a recent interest of mine that I've begun developing, and I'm embarking on this project that's beginning to look at the relationship between television, contemporary television, and daily life in South Asia, India in particular. And I wanted to start off right away by playing this clip, which is from season 3 of Indian Idol around 2007.
Singing along karaoke style, as the nation sings and swings with him, Amit Paul knows he's the king. Not only has he got a huge fan following rooting for his selection as the next Indian Idol, but here, in his Khasi warrior outfit, unknowingly he is doing the impossible, bridging the divide between the Khasi, Jaintia and Garo tribes of Meghalaya with that of the non-tribals. Little wonder then that Meghalaya wants Northeast's new pin-up boy to be their brand ambassador.
Amit Paul is the best, not just for Shillong, but he is a bull.
Amit's journey began in a local band called Yuva in Shillong in 1992, and in 15 years, the boy from the hills has certainly moved mountains with his voice, making it to Indian Idol's final round.
So I'm just lost. I can't say anything. It's so nice to see that you all are supporting me. Thank you so much.
As Amit Paul's fame takes levels of folklore in a music-crazy Northeast, some believe Elvis, after he left his home somewhere in Memphis, is now back in Shillong.
Amit Paul has towered over other Indian Idol participants this year. While thousands of his fans would love to see him win, even if he does not, he's already a real hero. In Guwahati with camera person Mukut Methi, Orijit San.
So this was around September 2007 as the contest reached some of the final stages. There were numerous other news reports that began focusing attention on how people in this part of the country had cast, and specifically in Meghalaya, this one state in particular, had cast aside decades-old separatist identities to mobilize support for one of these finalists, Amit Paul. And while some fans set up blogs and websites to generate interest and support from the rest of the country and abroad, others formed a fan club that began facilitating efforts by a range of groups and organizations to sponsor and manage public call offices in different parts of the state, distribute prepaid mobile phone cards, set up landline voting booths, and so on. And recognizing the ways in which some of these activities were already beginning to transcend all the long-standing ethnic, linguistic, religious, and spatial boundaries, state legislatures and politicians jumped into the fray very quickly, and the chief minister at the time declared Amit Paul to be Meghalaya's brand ambassador for peace, communal harmony, and excellence. And it seemed, at least for this brief period, that this campaign around a reality television program could in some way set the stage for a quite remarkable sort of refashioning of the socio-political terrain in this state. And one commentator in particular, a political scientist from the Northeast Hill University, said, when Meghalaya's history is written, it could well be divided into two distinct phases, one before the third Indian Idol contest and one after it. A deep tribal, non-tribal divide punctuated by killings, riots, and attempts at ethnic cleansing would mark the first phase. A return to harmony and the cosmopolitan ethos of the past would signify the second, the agent of change, Amit Paul. And during this time, residents of Darjeeling and other cities and towns in West Bengal, a neighboring sort of state, Sikkim and Nepal to some extent, were rallying behind the other contestant, Prashant Tamang. And Tamang, who had taken time off from his job as a police officer, a constable in Calcutta, he was able to capitalize on support from ethnic Nepalese across the subcontinent, but also those living in UK, UAE, and to some extent Hong Kong as well, who had all financed a Save Prashant SMS voting fund. And dubbed the Pride of the Hills, they soon began attracting political attention as well. And Subhash Gising, this one very interesting character, leader of the powerful Gorkha National Liberation Front, refused to publicly back Tamang, even when it was clear that this participant in Indian Idol was galvanizing Gorkhas across the region. And spotting this opportunity, Bimal Gurung, who's long been unhappy with this leader of the party, and he's always been accusing the main party of reaching a compromise with Delhi and betraying the cause of Gorkhaland, he launched a fundraising effort to finance a mass SMS campaign, and capitalizing on this, converted all the Prashant Tamang fan clubs into political party offices and launched a new party called the Gorkha Janmukti Morcha. And within days, all the fan clubs were converted, all of them drawn into this. And once again, it seemed as if for this period of time, reality television had played some sort of a role in altering the dynamics of Gorkha nationalism. And while all of this, we can step back and think about all of this and reflect on it. But the one thing that was in no doubt was that this phenomenon had attracted the attention of the rest of the subcontinent to this one part of the country that's often neglected, and even if there's any attention focused on it, it's usually grossly misrepresented by mainstream media institutions operating primarily out of Bombay and Delhi. And so this is what I want to begin to examine today, and with two goals in mind. And the first one is I want to use these events to assess the changing relationship between television, daily life, and contemporary political discourse in India. And second, to use this also as an occasion to begin thinking about participatory culture surrounding television, which has simply been unaddressed in this context of the subcontinent. And I want to be quite clear that I'm not suggesting any sort of direct link between reality television and the reconfiguration of politics in this part of the country. But what I want to do is begin to argue that what this points to is the importance of looking at participatory culture, looking at fan culture surrounding television as a really crucial site where politics, popular culture, and daily life intersect in new and right now in quite unpredictable ways. And the crucial shift that I want to make, and just keep this in the back of your mind as we go through the talk, is to understand this surrounding television in relation to daily life first, and only then in relation to political parties and election campaigns, which has tended to be the sort of knee-jerk theoretical response to any sort of fan politics, especially when we begin looking at film stars in South India, and I'll get to that towards the end of the paper. And in order to make this move away from this notion of fan politics or cinematic public spheres and so on, and to foreground the question of daily life, I'm beginning to develop this notion of what I'm calling mobile publics. And this is where I need some help with, and I'm looking forward to all your questions there. And I'm using it in two ways. The term mobile publics, I'm using at one level to draw attention to the defining role that mobile media technologies are playing in this process. And by mobile media technologies, I'm using it broadly. Cyber cafes, public call offices, mobile phones, the very practice of texting itself, all of that. And at the second level, to suggest that these kinds of mobile publics that cohere around what we just saw, these mass gatherings, the sort of voting behind contestants, that they create possibilities for the renewal of everyday kinds of interactions in public settings that may have been either forgotten, subdued, or made impossible in the context of something like in a place like Northeast India, right? So keep that in the back of your mind as we go forward. But where do we begin with all of this? And the first obvious starting point is let's map the institutional sort of cultural transitions that have happened with television in the subcontinent over the last 2 decades. And so one place to start is the early 1990s, when the entry of transnational television corporations like Star and the more translocal ones like Zee and Sun and Enadu, it's pretty clear that they've disrupted the hegemony of the state-sponsored network, Doordarshan. And what began as local cable operators just stringing cables from one rooftop to the other in the early 1990s and giving homes access to what at the time were 4 channels, Star News, Star Plus, BBC, and maybe Channel V or MTV, I forget which one came when. But by the end of the 1990s, this stabilized into a very solid sort of cable and satellite television industry, where they were estimating about 110 million viewers by the end of the 90s, and current industry figures put it at somewhere around 425 million. And in comparison to the pro-development nationalist sitcoms, dramas, the sort of pro-social soap operas that we watched on Doordarshan, these new television channels offer a much wider range of programming, including American soaps, dramas, talk shows, sitcoms, the entire gamut. And initially, while they attracted mostly English-speaking urban elites, the launch of Zee TV in particular, and Sun in South India, and Enadu targeting Tamil and Telugu-speaking populations, they quickly forced Star TV to rethink its sort of pan-Asian production strategies. And they began responding with what we now call English language programming, a mix of Hindi and English. And the emphasis then moved into the regional language television as well, and led to a lot of programming innovations. But there's only one specific part of it I want to focus on for the purposes of this talk, which is film and film-based programming. And when state-regulated Doordarshan, and this is going back to the early 1980s, in 1983, when the state broadcaster opened up the doors to sponsored programming, marking a departure from an earlier public service model with an express goal of utilizing television for modernization and so on, some of the most early and popular shows were film-based. The Saturday evening Hindi language film, the song show Chitrahar, and this one show called Show Theme were all some of the popular shows in early Doordarshan. And this is an example of, this is pre-Nielsen, pre-audience metric days, where this one trade magazine, the only trade magazine on television to my knowledge, called TV and Video World, published out of Bombay with some writers in Delhi as well, they started doing these program popularity indexes, and it became a sort of one register for Doordarshan to understand what was popular. And if you look at this list, it's really, besides Different Strokes, Hum Log, which was the pro-social sort of soap opera, there was Hindi news, there was Show Theme, Star Trek, Chaya Geet and Chitrahar are both film song-based shows, and then Lucy, which is reruns of I Love Lucy. And this was Show Theme, where Show Theme was a really interesting sort of early format within Doordarshan, where this one woman, Manju Singh, who used to run an advertising company in Bombay, spotted an opportunity, and they would just pick one theme. They would pick, Dosti, or friendship, and they would cobble together clips and songs from a range of Hindi films that spoke to this theme. And they would put together this 30-minute program, which I think in many ways signaled what MTV and Channel V would then begin doing in the late 90s. So one of the things I want to argue is that Indian Idol and contemporary sort of reality television, especially the singing song-based reality television, can be traced back to these programs, but also crucially two which satellite television introduced, which is Antakshari and Saregama, both on Zee TV, which tapped into the enduring popularity of film songs and also introduced an element of audience participation that further distinguished them from Doordarshan. And there was nothing about the audience in these shows, unlike those. While Antakshari was designed as an amateur singing contest, Saregama, which premiered on Zee in 1995, was framed as a serious competition that could launch contestants' careers in the world of playback singing. And some of them have gone on to become really famous playback singers at this point. Now, these shows redefined film-based television programming and even anticipated some of the generic elements of what we today recognize to be reality television. But really, the crucial show which marked the onset of what we might begin to call a new televisual regime was Kaun Banega Crorepati, or the Indian version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, which launched on Star Plus in 2000. And at first glance, when you look at something like KBC, it appears identical to any other international version. Right? And the producers of Kaun Banega Crorepati are contractually obligated to reproduce down to the exact detail, the trademark sort of title design, the show sets, music, question format, the seating, the lights. All of this is laid out in a close to 150-page document that's owned by Celador Productions, the company that first produced the format. And there is now a new kind of production personnel on these sets whose only job is to maintain this kind of continuity between that 150-page document and what's being shot. But once you begin looking at the actual show itself, and they roped in Amitabh Bachchan, arguably the most popular film star in the subcontinent, you begin to recognize how there's a lot of innovation and imitation. It's a sort of back and forth between imitating this format and small sort of innovations. Amitabh Bachchan, for instance, addresses the computer as Computer G. Little things like that, which sought to Indianize these sorts of reality television shows. But more importantly, questions of genre aside, they really brought about a new kind of relationship between television and how the television industry professionals both imagined and mobilized what we call a national audience. I mean, this was a time when viewership was at an all-time low. Star TV approaches Celador, they rope in Amitabh Bachchan, and by July 2000, and these are industry figures, where over 200,000 people across the country were calling each day for a chance to participate on Kaun Banega Crorepati and share a stage with Amitabh Bachchan, leading a lot of people to realize that the 570 telephone lines that were installed in 4 major cities expressly for this purpose alone, you could only use these telephone lines to call in and answer those 10 questions, which would maybe get you onto the show, that they were simply inadequate. And KBC represented a major sort of really crucial departure in that it complicated industry professionals' understanding of the audience by bringing viewers in smaller towns and cities. And these are small towns and cities which are generally not represented in the Nielsen sort of people meter sample. They're left alone. You don't get a sense of the audience about who's watching what from these second-tier towns. And Middle India, as the English language press dubbed this segment of viewers, had registered in metropolitan television executives' imaginations in a quite unprecedented manner by the end of the first season of Kaun Banega Crorepati. And by 2005, when the second version aired, and by the time Indian Idol premiered on Sony, phone usage had grown exponentially as well. And more crucially for my purposes here, that the practice of texting had become a sort of unobtrusive and taken for granted feature of daily life. And that the television and marketing industries had to quickly respond and redraw the map of the audience. And in spite of all this technological and cultural flux, the one thing that was certain for these industries was the revenues that they were making with these deals between television, advertising, and cell phone carriers. But this is, broadly speaking, the institutional and cultural sort of shifts around television that I think help us situate where did Indian Idol come from. And before we get to what Indian Idol did in terms of generating this kind of response from fan communities, the very instance of participatory culture breaking into the mainstream of Indian television, quick sort of overview of the Northeast and the politics of the Northeast. I mean, why should we pay attention to this? Why is this such a remarkable phenomenon? So Northeast India, for those of you who aren't familiar with the map, it's a group of states which is connected to the mainland by a rather narrow boundary. At its narrowest, it's about 20 kilometers wide, and it's commonly referred to as the chicken's neck. And it's Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, and Tripura. Those are the states that form this collection called the Northeast. And everyone recognizes, of course, that it's a very, very reductive sort of construct for what's a very diverse and, as one scholar put it, it's a bustling terrain underscoring a million heterogeneities. That's really what it is. But it's a term that remains unavoidable. It's widely used. And it's been known as Northeast India from the early 1960s, when the region's map was redrawn by the Indian state in an attempt to manage all the sort of independentist rebellions, particularly among the Nagas and the Mizos at the time, and to preempt any sort of other radical political mobilizations that the state might begin to see from other discontented ethnic groups. And there were many of them, and there continue to be many of them. Well, we shouldn't be seeing that now. Right. And even though these states share a lot of international borders with Bangladesh, China, and Myanmar, the complexities of the Indian state's relation with these other nation states have restricted any sort of cross-border flows, and it only exacerbates this region's isolation. So over the past 4 decades, virtually every state in the Northeast has witnessed the emergence of powerful militias that have contested the state's narrative of socioeconomic progress, becoming part of the national mainstream, and so on. And as a number of sort of activists have pointed out, the state's brutal repression of these struggles and draconian measures, especially one, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in the Northeast, which gives the army really license to do anything they want and protection at the same time and gives them legal immunity from independent investigation of their actions. And this hasn't helped much either. So if on the one hand, the Indian state is unwilling and unable to think outside the nation-building national development narrative, The political movements in this region also seem unable to imagine anything apart from the logic of statehood. There isn't any sort of new definition of community that's emerging from these political movements. And for over a century now, this is a part of the region that's attracted migration. And the resulting sort of demographic shifts have been one of the major causes for ethnic violence and the implementation of a protective sort of discrimination regime. It's called the Sixth Schedule that New Delhi brokered between a lot of these states. But this system, this sort of protective discrimination, not surprisingly, has led to privileging the rights of certain historically disadvantaged scheduled tribes, so property, business, and trade licenses, and it led to a notion of exclusive homelands where certain ethnically defined groups are privileged and others are treated as outsiders. And so some of these transitions are transition to sedentary agriculture, the redefinition of land and property rights. All of these have been causing immense tension in this region. And just very briefly, Sanjeev Barua, who's been writing a lot about the political struggles in this part of the country, he writes particularly about the tensions between Khasis and non-Khasis, which becomes very important to understand the Amit Paul phenomenon. And Khasis are one of the scheduled tribes in Meghalaya, and they refer to the non-Khasis as Dakars or foreigners in the Khasi language. And these tensions have shaped everyday life in Meghalaya for over 3 decades now. And the struggles are generally over who can and cannot claim to be a Khasi. And once they passed these laws, and there was fights about a proposed change which have allowed only children of 2 Khasi parents to be regarded as a Khasi, the question of who and who is not is of great importance because of all the sort of reservations and the protective discriminations that this group gets. And in recounting this controversy, Barua kind of points out that modernizing this kinship system was actually a step backwards, and it ended up leading to a rather rigid definition of who could claim citizenship in Meghalaya. That the actually existing system that's been in place for several centuries was far more progressive and would have been able to deal with the demographic and cultural changes by keeping the ethnic boundary of who's a Khasi in some ways quite porous. And this divisive language, though, it continues to shape political debates here, and it's crucial to understanding what happened in the Indian Idol phenomenon. And here's the surprising thing. Given all of this, given the complexity of the politics in this region, given the Indian state's relationship with the region, I was a little taken aback to come across research which said neither All India Radio nor Doordarshan invested any effort in trying to extend coverage and produce locally relevant programming in this part of the country. They just didn't bother. Even into the 1990s, All India Radio was broadcasting with low-power transmitters that couldn't compete with any of the other much more powerful transmissions from Bangladesh or China or the Philippines. And besides the lack of technical facilities and support for production staff, they did not even know the local language. And Hindi language programming only served to alienate listeners even further. And the situation with television production was even worse. For instance, the Doordarshan station in Meghalaya's capital city of Shillong was, until 1998, operating with just 2 program executives who produced 75 minutes of daily programming. And 75 minutes of daily program is quite a lot, and for 2 people to produce on a daily basis. And they did so, moreover, with no knowledge of the local language and without key production personnel like editors and floor managers. This was like a 2-man shop doing the entire thing, the entire process of media production for Doordarshan in Meghalaya. And where news was concerned, New Delhi did not use dispatches from this part of the country, relying on correspondents who rarely ventured outside the confines of district headquarters in large cities like Guwahati in the state of Assam. And not surprisingly, this state of affairs didn't change with the entry of cable and satellite television. From the perspective of Zee or Sony or Star, this just wasn't a lucrative market. They didn't bother with increasing teledensity. The number of cable and satellite homes in this region still remains low. And in fact, this entire region did not even figure in the 14-city auditions for Indian Idol. Prashant Tamang since he was in Calcutta, he went to the auditions there. Amit Paul had to travel all the way to Bombay to get into the contest. And there are numerous instances one can begin to point out about stereotypical portrayals of Northeast states across print, across film, across television, which speak very directly to a sort of othered status, and it marks a racial fault line between the Northeast and the rest of the country. So this is then the landscape of television, changes in the mobile phone and relationship between new media and television, and the politics of the Northeast, within which then we can begin to ask, okay, so what happened with Indian Idol 3? So this was a television program that's produced jointly by Sony Entertainment and 2 production companies in Bombay. One of them is Optimistics, and the other is Miditech. And Miditech is a key sort of company here because they have a long history going back to Doordarshan. This was set up by 2 brothers, the Alva brothers, and the mother, Margaret Alva, was an MP at the time, and hence they got access to producing programs for Doordarshan. And these two brothers have become really powerful forces in the Bombay television world at this point in time. And it immediately began attracting viewers. The very first season attracted about 40 million viewers and generated about 30 million SMSs during the first season, with judges drawn from Bollywood, celebrities making guest appearances, and specially designed episodes in which contestants meet soldiers in New Delhi on Republic Day, attend workshops with Hollywood star Richard Gere, record songs to be used for tsunami relief fundraising, and so on. They managed to keep viewer interest pretty high across all the seasons. And from the very beginning, the public discussions have always revolved around how regionalism has featured very prominently in Indian Idol. And to some extent, you can see that even in American Idol, I think, if you're a fan of that show. There's always debates about, southern contestants versus country singing contestants and all of that. But the first two seasons didn't generate anywhere near the kind of attention that the third season did. And the most striking aspect of what happened around Amit Paul was the sheer range and number of organizations that got involved. And here's a list of some of them. One of them was the Shillong Arts and Music Lovers Forum, the Civil Society Women's Organization, Society for Performing Arts Development, the Bihari Youth Welfare Association, the Frontier Chamber of Commerce, the Marwadi Ekta Manch or the Marwadi Unity Platform, and several smaller clubs in different localities of Shillong that drew people in from different caste, ethnic, linguistic, and religious backgrounds. And with the Amit Paul Fan Club, it served as an umbrella organization for all of these other organizations which wanted to participate in this voting. And in addition to organizing rallies through the city to raise awareness and drum up support for Amit Paul, these groups also were working very hard to ensure that their contestant received enough votes to stay on in the competition. I mean, at a very basic level, Meghalaya is a small state, and they needed to make sure that they were voting enough and in enough numbers so that he stayed in the competition, as opposed to, let's say, a contestant from Bombay or Madras or Hyderabad, who just by default gets a lot more votes. And working closely with local businessmen, including one man called Dwarka Singhania, who's the treasurer of the Meghalaya Chambers of Commerce and Industry, fans ensured that public call offices in residential areas and several prominent locations in Shillong remained open all night for people to come forward and cast their vote. And as Amit Paul progressed through the competition, attracting attention in Meghalaya and other northeastern states, fan activity intensified and funds were raised to create publicity materials and even distribute prepaid mobile phone cards for free. And it's useful to note here that unlike American Idol, where you're only allowed to vote for a period of 2 hours after the show ends, in this case, you're allowed to vote for about 11 hours, from 9 p.m. until 8 a.m. the next day. So this was really a sort of round-the-clock phenomenon. And viewers can send their vote in you could send it by SMS, you can send a televote through using a landline telephone, you can use an interactive voice service that one of the .coms that SIFI set up. And voting was also not restricted just to viewers in India. You could vote across the UK and the Middle East. UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and Bahrain, viewers there were also participating in all of this. And over 3 months, about 2.5, 3 months, it became clear that mobilization around Amit Paul had created a sort of neutral space for a range of people to work together, and that the many public activities had dramatically changed the way different groups inhabited the city of Shillong. In a city where areas are clearly demarcated along ethnic and linguistic lines, for example, if you're a Bengali-speaking 18-year-old college student, you would not dare walk into the Khasi-speaking area of Maulai, which is often described as a cradle of Khasi subnationalism. You would fear for your life if you walked in there, let's say 2 years ago. And in this kind of a situation, in this way in which space is marked in the city, the reception that Amit Paul received when he visited Maulai as part of his first visit to Shillong after competing in Indian Idol seemed remarkable even to the most jaded observers. And Amit Paul, we should note, is a middle-class Bengali, non-Khasi, who was born and raised in Assam, who had moved to Meghalaya. This is exactly the kind of family that has been at the receiving end of a lot of Khasi violence by Khasi youth. And a lot of observers just puzzled. They were like, how did this one contestant emerge as a catalyst for changing relations in Meghalaya? Suddenly, Khasis and non-Khasis were hanging out and chatting over a cup of coffee when waiting in line to cast their vote. How did all of this happen? And so to begin with, some of the things had already begun, things that started shifting in the last 4 to 5 years, and these civil society organizations were already making moves towards peaceful resolution of long-standing issues. But secondly, it seemed Amit Paul's background, he's a high school dropout who had to struggle in a marginalized state and region of the country, resonated deeply with youth across the region, with questions of ethnicity seemingly receding into the background. And as one of the political scientists in that region remarked, said, in a place where there's nothing much to celebrate, Amit came as a godsend. He's talented, he's won all our hearts, by singing Khasi, Nepali, Hindi, and English songs on the show. It reminded people of the cosmopolitan culture that once prevailed in the state, and they have been overcome by the desire to restore the happy, multi-ethnic character of the state. That sounds all nice. But let's see what exactly happened. And finally, Amit Paul's participation in a national contest like Indian Idol was seen as a unique opportunity for Meghalaya and other states in the Northeast as well to assert their presence and claim belonging in the national family. And there's no doubt there were a lot of schisms. As with any sort of fan politics, any sort of fan mobilization, there were a lot of breaks and ruptures in the momentum that was generated by the Amit Paul fan club, with groups like the Shillong Arts and Music Lovers Forum complaining that politicians were leveraging this moment for narrow reasons. And activist writers and journalists like Patricia Mukim, they began posing critical questions as well. They were asking, why is recognition from the rest of the country so important? And if it was because people in Meghalaya were unsure of their belonging in the national family and so on. But for the most part, this reality television event had seemed to set the stage for a gradual reconfiguration of cultural and political relationships. But here's the real sort of puzzling question. So given the socio-historical context of the region, given the seeming sort of intractability of all of these ethnic conflicts, what happens when these sorts of publics dissipate after the reality program ends? I mean, what are the cultural and political implications of a public like this that lasts a few weeks or a month at best? I think that's the key sort of question that we need to grapple with here. And where do we begin to understand how reality television is now beginning to connect up to politics? For me, the obvious starting point was Arvind Rajagopal's work, and the one book that he wrote, a very influential one called Politics After Television, in which he analyzed the links between television and the rise of Hindu nationalism in the late 80s and early 90s. Immediately after the screening, after Doordarshan, in a sort of reversal of state policy, decided to screen the Hindu epic Ramayana on state-owned television, he traces that. And to understand the work and power of television, he says, and broadly even media in a country, Rajagopal begins by setting up this notion of a split public. And he argues that we need to first take into account the ways in which the normative sort of fiction of a bourgeois public becomes difficult to preserve when it comes to electronic media, and that all the fissures, linguistic fissures, class fissures, caste fissures, they become undeniable. And that we need to take into account that in such a field, in this kind of a fissured split public, the introduction of a new system of representation, television in this case, sets up new circuits of exchange across a split public, thereby causing the existing terms of translation and the status of the public sphere itself into crisis. So in other words, television can be understood as a medium that extends the reach of the political terrain that's in place, and that it brings into orbit zones of society that seldom encounter each other, at least in face-to-face. Maybe they do on television. And this much is readily observable in what I've sketched so far, that there is a very fissured sort of public space in Shillong and Meghalaya and across the Northeast. But Rajagopal's analysis is mainly concerned with a very different sort of televisual regime. It was in a moment where, for all its problems, Doordarshan could still imagine something called the national audience, however fissured that was. At least it was a working way for producers at Doordarshan to imagine an audience. But we need to then begin to account for the ways in which the mobilization of different kinds of publics by cable and satellite television now work. And in the case of reality television, the impact of mobile media technologies on viewing practices is the first step, but also in creating spaces and for conversation and participation. And here then, when we turn to questions of participatory culture, we have to talk about fandom. And this is, of course, the famous picture of the kid in Slumdog Millionaire who jumps into a pile of shit so he can get there in time to get Amitabh Bachchan's autograph. Endearing, yes, to some extent, but deeply problematic, as I'll lay out. So the only person who's really written a lot about participatory culture surrounding media is a scholar, S.V. Srinivas, working in Bangalore. And he's written really a lot about the Telugu film industry and viewing practices in Andhra Pradesh more broadly, theorizing fan activity as a dialectic of devotion and defiance, a sort of constant struggle back and forth between fan expectations and the industry's careful management of the star persona to derive maximum mileage. So he focuses on megastar Chiranjeevi. I have a picture of MGR from Tamil Nadu, since that's my sort of entry into fandom. He situates the formation of fan clubs in Andhra Pradesh in relation to a broader history of subaltern struggles and considers fan practices as a domain of political activity that does not fit within classical liberal accounts of citizenship or political representation, but one that has very clear links to linguistic and regional identity. And just to explain this a little further, this is a state in which the 5 chief ministers of the state so far have all had links to the film industry, either as directors, writers, or as stars. And this is one of the earliest ones, M.G. Ramachandran, who was a star in the film industry. And on the basis, and his fan clubs were the ones that mobilized once he decided to enter the formal realm of politics. It's his fan clubs that were mobilized to get him into office. And this reads in Tamil, Manida Kadavul, or God in the shape of man, I guess would be the translation. And it says, Ulaga Adisayam Shri MGR Ulaga Sadhanai. So it's like, and this is after MGR is dead and gone, well and truly dead. And these are fans still generating these posters, doing civil sort of blood donation work on his behalf. And this is sort of, they consider this a world record of fan associations doing work in the state. And Srinivas looks at these sorts of fan activities to say that the consumption of film becomes an occasion for a range of performances that are broadly political in nature. And one manifestation being the link to party politics and election campaigns. So this, for example, is another example of how his films even now get released in theaters by his fan associations. They actually secure distribution rights and screen these films, but mostly at single-screen cinema halls. And this is from one single-screen theater in Bangalore that's remaining called Natraj and close to Malleshwaram. And people like Srinivas, they've been arguing for a long time that we need to understand the political nature of these fan associations beyond just a question of politics and identity or nationalism. But they maintain that fan activity is political because it develops around the notion of what they call spectatorial rights. And by this, they mean that the cinema exists because of my presence and me. The I at the cinema is already a member of a collective. We make the film happen. Anyone who has watched a Chiranjeevi or Rajnikant film knows exactly what I'm talking about. And yes, to an extent, we do know what he's talking about. These are films with a very specific formula, worked out over nearly 2 decades, in which the entry of the film saw the opening screen shot, for example, is, let's say, MGR, where you see his back turned around, and the opening shot is a little dramatic sort of turn with the hands folded, and a direct sort of address at the fans in the audience, the first 4 rows. And throughout the film, there are these moments where there are direct sort of contact with the gaze, direct sort of references to fan associations, at times working fan association suggestions into the script of the film, all of those sorts of negotiations. And so this articulation of cinema's relationship to public culture and democracy with the figure of the fan occupying center stage, this is what lies so far at the heart of our understanding of what we might call participatory culture surrounding media in India. And we also have to grapple with I'll get to this in a second. We also have to grapple with concerns that the image of the fan that we derive from all of this surrounding the cinema hall, which is, as I see it, obsessive, male, working class, and rowdy. And this is an example of the, in quotes, excessive behavior of fans in cinema halls across the subcontinent, where this is a fan-produced sort of large billboard that's placed outside the cinema hall on the first day, first show of this film screening. And this is sort of a film called Shivaji, and all these little pictures you see, these are the main sort of fan association members, with this guy being the secretary of a fan association, which is a national organization, and all of these are the regional sort of secretaries across different states, and one of them happens to be a Chicago-based sort of fan who runs the online Rajnikant Fan Association here. And so this excessive sort of behavior which marks viewers in front rows of cinema halls, what Liang calls the protocols of collective behavior. And what are those protocols? Whistling and commenting loudly, throwing flowers, coins, or ribbons when the star first appears on the screen, singing along. Hey, I did this. So it's routinely cited as what distinguishes fans from the rest of the audience, and this is true to an extent. But the publicness of fan association activities, celebrating a star's birthday, the 100 days of a film, organizing special pre-release functions, adorning street corners with giant cutouts of the star, decorating theaters where the film has had a successful run, this was all, in good fun in high school. And press coverage of such activities, they continue sort of marginalize fan activities that are undesirable, at vulgar, and at times dangerous as well. And keep in mind that sometimes stars of powerful sort of fan associations of 2 powerful stars often clash on the streets in violent street fights as well in cities like Hyderabad and Madras, not yet in the diaspora, but I wouldn't be surprised if it slowly creeps in here as well. So fans, what are fans? In this view, fans are imperfect citizens or even non-citizens. They're imperfect in aesthetic terms, in socio-cultural terms, and in political terms. And as I see it, academic sort of interest in this kind of rowdy fan associations has resulted, if in anything, a romanticization of fan associations as belonging to the realm of what Partha Chatterjee calls political society, which a term that Chatterjee has proposed to conceptualize relations between individuals and groups that are outside the sort of rule-bound and legal framework of civil society. So this is what we have. This is our understanding of fandom in the subcontinent and participatory culture generally. But I would begin to argue that to bracket fans as a non-elite public and to theorize rowdy fan practices as somehow a wonderful expression of subaltern politics is deeply misleading if it leads us to ignore other kinds of realms and modes of participation. And the crucial difference that we need to begin acknowledging and work through is that television, as a technology and as a medium of communications, is home-centered. It's not a public technology at a very basic level. And Raymond Williams's observation of broadcasting as that which, quote, served at once a mobile and a home-centered way of living, a form of mobile privatization, is, I think, worth recounting. And building on this, Paddy Scannell's argument that television signals the beginning of our being at home in the world, that any radio listener or TV viewer can and does move back and forth between two worlds and two times, the world of the home and the world of the broadcast world, right? It's this constant back and forth. And I think this is useful to begin understanding what happened with Indian Idol, and that this is the communicative affordance, as Scannell puts it, of television, this being at home and in the world simultaneously, of occupying two spaces and two worlds, two temporalities and two spatialities. And this begins to explain, I think, why there has been no history of a fan association surrounding a soap opera on national television, like, say, Humlog. Participatory culture surrounding television tends not to have the same kinds of public dimensions that cinema does, which is what makes the Indian Idol phenomenon, I think, all the more remarkable. That this is the first kind of instance of participatory culture surrounding television which takes on such a public dimension. And what made this possible? At this point, I want to begin by suggesting that it's quite simply mobile media. And this is why I'm beginning to think about the notion of mobile publics as a way of drawing attention to the centrality of these mobile media technologies, to highlight the formation of publics, and the fluid and sort of ephemeral nature of these publics that formed around Amit Paul. They're gone. 4 weeks later, is there an Amit Paul fan club? No. Are there these landline voting booths? No. Are the Khasis and non-Khasis talking? Maybe, but they're back to the same kinds of suspicion, and the threat of violence is back into Shillong again. But then I want to begin to suggest that the transient nature of these mobile publics are actually what allows for the articulation of new kinds of cultural and political possibilities. So Indian Idol 3 then was a crucial phenomenon precisely because the publics that cohered around Amit Paul created the possibility, and the space also, crucially, for the renewal of everyday forms of interaction across ethnic, religious, spatial, and linguistic boundaries that have been subdued and rendered difficult, if not impossible, over the decades. In other words, Indian Idol 3 created spaces in which people had to acknowledge their differences and set them aside, if only for a brief period of time. And in doing so, they were afforded a glimpse of the everyday that was not shot through with suspicion and the threat of violence. Here, for example, is another video that I think demonstrates this really well.
It was a victory celebration that went wrong, as residents of Dhalupara in Shillong were busy celebrating not only India's cricket victory, but Prashant Damang's win in Indian Idol 3. Some miscreants started pelting stones in reaction to Damang's victory celebration. But the situation soon came under control as the police restrained the crowd. While some reacted to Amit Paul's failure in violence, the majority of Shillong is sad and silent, refusing to believe anyone else can be Indian Idol.
Nothing is changed. For us, he's Indian Idol. He was Indian Idol for us, and he will remain Indian Idol for us.
Amit is very young, and at this stage he got the title of Brand Ambassador of Peace and Harmony.
That's his sister.
So he united the people. At this stage he got such a big title, and he united the people of Shillong.
For the moment, these messages of love and support stay united in the main square of Shillong.
As brand ambassador of peace and communal harmony for Amit Paul, the journey now begins. And with this amount of support, signature of people of different communities, the road ahead seems a positive one. In Shillong with...
So here's what then, in the end, I'm beginning to think about what mobile publics mean. At one level, I'm using mobile publics to relate to the emergence of what we could call a hybrid mediascape and the development of both technological but cultural capacities to circulate and share ideas, images, and information in ways that were not possible earlier. They are, in one anthropologist, Mizuko Ito's terms, networked publics that are communicating more and more through complex networks that are bottom up, top down, as well as side to side. So we need to first understand how and in what ways mobile media, cyber cafes, public call offices, mobile phones, have reconfigured the communicative affordances of television in South Asia. Is texting, sending a vote for your favorite contestant, a new way of being at home and in the world? Is it a new way of being at home and in touch with the world? And is that an added affordance that is unprecedented in some ways? But I would also argue that mobile publics are more than just collectives that are informed or networked through new communication technologies. Mobile publics need to be understood more broadly as interventions, not stable formations, really just interventions, that if only momentarily suggest new cultural and political possibilities, and this is crucial, within the realm of everyday life. And here I'm beginning to turn to the work that Veena Das has done on the question of the daily life when she draws on Stanley Cavell and Wittgenstein and so on, where she writes looking at the violence of partition in 1947 in the subcontinent and subsequently the massacre of Sikhs in 1984, where she says, life was recovered not through some grand gestures in the realm of the transcendent, but through a descent into the ordinary. And I think that's a beautifully telling phrase, the descent into the ordinary, which I think captures some of what Indian Idol 3 did. And she goes on to say that just as I think of the event as attached to the everyday, I think of the everyday itself as eventful. And this move, I think, is crucial, that we need to avoid the theoretical impulse to explain moments of such participation around television solely in relation to the realm of politics. And it's crucial if we are to understand why and how the everydayness of watching a reality television show and sending a text message becomes deeply meaningful in fissured spaces like Shillong. In a context where the idea of a neighborhood tea shop or a coffee shop as a space for public gathering and deliberation has been unimaginable for several decades now, the term mobile publics allows us to recognize how these new technologies are engendering new forms of sociality around television and thereby reshaping the terrain of daily life. So I want to end basically with this. Towards the end, as I work through this, maybe this is where I'm beginning to think now, that it's not so much a question about reality television changing the terrain of politics, but rather beginning to ask if politics can remain the same after reality television. So I'll stop there and take questions.